Please continue to eat, but we're going to transition into our first keynote address. So want to again reiterate, continue to eat while we have this keynote address, but those of you who, some of you might want to turn around and face the podium if you're facing the back of the room. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rod McClure. Dr. McClure is the Dean of the School of Medicine at University of New England, the other University of New England. And we deeply want to say thanks to Rod for coming 17,000 kilometres to give this talk today. Many of us have travelled a long way to be here today, but no one has travelled as far as Rod. So just say thanks for that. None of us enjoy air travel, but that's truly sterling service. Rod has worked at the CDC for a couple of years as head of the division of, had a couple of titles there, but basically research practice integration. And before that, he was in Australia. And Rod is one of those unique people who sees both the academic side and the intellectual side of systems thinking, but also sees the pragmatic realities. He's overseen MEWA, which is a Monash University Highway Safety Research Centre. So he understands the pragmatic realities of the world of highway safety at the same time as grasping some of the deeper concepts of systems thinking. And so in that regard, I think, Rod, you really are pretty unique around the world. He's also editor-chief of Injury Prevention, which is a journal I send articles to, so I'll get off the stage.
Thanks very much, Steve. And thank you to the organising committee who've invited me to present, and to you all for having me. I'm very much enjoying the day so far and look forward to the next day and a half, and it's well worth the 17,000 kilometres if that's what it was. Yes, Steve, I've had probably about 35 years experience in road safety. Given I'm probably 15 years older than the average person here, and there are 300 people here, what we've got is a situation where 35 years experience is talking to 6,000 years experience and trying to make an impact. And I'm not quite sure that's the right way around. How much better would it be if I turned this around to face you and got you to give me the lecture on safe systems and system safety? That would be a better lecture. There is absolutely no doubt about that. And that's not a trivial comment. That's probably the main message that I want to make today. Now, you're going to come back to me and say, well, how can you get 300 people talking at once and get anything out of that whatsoever? So while my main message is that's where the expertise, talent and solutions will lie, the challenge for me as an individual here is to try and find a methodology that would allow that to be integrated into a forward-moving, productive direction and an effective way of doing business. So over the 35 years I've muddled around, but started very much at the expert telling everybody else what's good for them, to the point where this slide now demonstrates my latest contribution to knowledge, published just a couple of weeks ago. This is a photo from that paper. It's not what that paper says, or that chapter in the book, that's not what it says that was particularly important or valuable. It's this picture and the process that I think makes this, to date, the best contribution that I've been able to achieve. Now, if you look around that, there's only one person in that picture that actually looks a little bit disinterested. I'm not sure whether this will show up against the light, so I'll just have you talk through the faces. But look at each of them. Eyes are light, alert, trying to examine something on the board there, whole screen of information on the board there. The one that's not looking particularly interested in the middle is the guy who's the data scientist who's orchestrated the actual displays and is obviously worried a little bit about how it's all going to hang together and hang up. But the data on that was data that we generated from a lot of qualitative interaction with these same people, processed it using some quantitative modelling techniques, and then redisplayed several options for them to choose between. And they're playing through those options and seeing with great delight what the data is telling them about what they told the data. So that's my first focus for this next discussion is around a methodology that allows us to integrate conversations in a way that makes explicit the assumptions that underpin those conversations and reflects back to individuals in an ongoing real-time manner that information so that they can readjust their thinking and make another set of decisions. Which brings me to my second point. Where are you going to be in 5 years as an individual? And in thinking through answering that question, how many of you did a quick survey, looked at the correlation between age, gender, income, looked at the latitudes, the temperatures, created a hypothetical counterfactual which says, okay, the best spot for me to be is there? Or did you run a whole series of simulations in your head using a whole lot of different types of data and then readjust it when you thought through the consequences and the complications of the decision that you came up with and then move forward a bit further? Hands up who hasn't got a frontal lobe. No one, in which case everybody has your own inbuilt system simulator that you use on a daily basis. Except sometimes when you come to work, except often when you come to work, somehow you leave yourself at home and you adopt this other methodology which is enforced upon you usually by your boss, and apologies to all bosses here, who expect you to think a completely different way to deliver something. And when you leave, you go back to your usual systems thinking processes. So, given that you've got a lot more experience collectively than I, given that you've all got your own systems processes, that you've been simulating basically decision making for just about everything that's important to you, what's left is there for me to do in the next 40 minutes? Well, I've hinted at it. It's to give you the confidence. It's basically the job of a sports psychologist. It's to give you the confidence in yourself that you can be able to take problems on and that you have the wherewithal to think and the permission to think in a way that's going to deliver you the best possible solution to that problem under the circumstances and knowledge that you have. And to think critically about the new information that you're getting and the consequences of the actions that you take on the basis of those decisions. Now, if you talk to systems people, you'll find they settle themselves into multiple camps. And most of us, I think, approach systems science from the perspective of the discipline that we started in life with and then took into systems science, rather than started off in systems science. So I tend to be a reductionist, epidemiologically driven, quantitative systems scientist, which is going to irritate the life out of somebody who comes into systems science from a more qualitative perspective. But I don't think that really matters. But what I can contribute in this is, from that perspective, a short illustration of how you can use the quantitative methodologies behind some of the discussions that we've had this morning to help you make explicit the assumptions that you make and to help you use systems thinking to hold yourself accountable. I'll touch on a whole lot of really complicated processes in a way that makes them look incredibly simple. So that will be the challenge for me to try and do that. But in doing that, I think what I aim to demonstrate is that it's doable, that it's something which is useful. And then at the end of it, I'm going to leave you the task through the next day and a half of asking yourself how you actually apply what I've been suggesting to the information you're getting from people in other sessions who think slightly differently about systems to I do, and how you would apply it in your workplace when you go back. recognising that there is a tendency for people to come into rooms like this, talk to people who agree with them, go back to the workplace, and then all of this stays behind. So the task is, I am not going to actually try and persuade you or advocate. What I'm going to do today is just give you some examples of how I've done some research which has used this tool, these quantitative applications inside systems thinking, and you can like it, leave it, you can like it, use it. Hopefully you will criticise it and explore it, because as I said, the balance of capability in this room is very much on that side of the room, and most system thinkers will start off by admitting that they haven't got it right. I moved from a long way, as I said, from an expert who was telling other people what to do. Doctors tend to like to be right, and I used to get highly offended when I was proven not to be. And I've gone a long way, and I now recognise I start off being wrong and work towards just being less and less wrong as the conversation moves forward. So let's get down to some reasonably practical basics and get moving. The safe system model largely operationalised in kinetic energy management terms. Or me closer to the microphone. The safe systems model, as it's applied in Australia, is largely applied in kinetic energy management terms. I believe it's not the model as envisaged initially when it was discussed in terms of Vision Zero in Sweden, but it's certainly the way it's applied in Australia, and it's very much around controlling the transmission of energy to the body and using a number of different mechanisms for doing so, and focusing in particular on safe roads, safe vehicles, safe road users. Giving responsibility for safety of that system to the system designers, but recognising the system designers oblige users of that system to stick within the design rules. Sounds a little engineering, and in the context of Australia, it was largely the engineers who were managing that safe systems philosophy. I mentioned I started off in medicine. This was a scene that I was called to at 2 o'clock in the morning. This is the next morning when the sun came up, on a country road. This was 1990. I wasn't long graduated, and there were 2 medical practitioners and a lot of SES emergency staff. 35 people died at this, about 41 were injured. Coroners, which is our medical examiner slash legal examiner combined, a case that followed, identified lack of seat belts, lack of good fittings of seats, so they weren't properly fixed to the tracks of the cabin, and poor road design as being features that needed to be corrected, and suggested that this road, which was a highway between our major coastal towns on the east coast of Australia, be converted to a dual carriageway, 2 lanes in each direction. So this was a safe systems approach of solving the problem. How do we manage the energy transfer? This is where we're currently up to with the highway upgrade. You can see the yellow line is that still under construction. The green has been completed. That's 30 years in the making and $20 billion in US dollars expenditure. We're still not there, although obviously great progress has been made. The photograph is an illustration of the quality road that compares with the previous road. Probably the extra facts that I didn't mention that caused the drift of one bus into the other would have been driver fatigue. But a simple driver fatigue mistake created that sort of outcome. And as we've heard this morning, the safe systems model needs to or expects us to build redundancy into the system so that we can accommodate minor mistakes without killing people. So this is a great model. It produces wonderful results. We haven't had an episode or an event like the one I've just described since. The WHO and the global partners worked together to launch a decade of action through the United Nations around about 2011, being converted recently in its rhetoric to sustainability goals outcomes. But they took the same approach, the safe management of a whole system with infrastructure, vehicles, road users, and a bit of post-crash response as being the mechanisms by which the advantages that have been created in the rich income countries, how that can be translated to the rest of the world who are going through various stages of economic development. And I'm quoting here from the report itself, the Decade of Action report. Guided by this plan, the Decade of Action offers a framework for policy practice and advocacy to help countries achieve sustainable development goals. And the slippages here is from the Decade of Action through to a sustainable development goal, whether or not, and I'm arguing perhaps not, we actually changed the approach we're using when we changed the terminology. And this is the results as published by the WHO last year. In low-income countries, this approach, i.e. taking what works in high-income countries and using the assumptions that hold in high-income countries and leaving the motor vehicle as and all the assumptions about the motor vehicle's role in transport intact, and then moving across to fixing the car, fixing the roads and getting the drivers to drive better, has produced zero improvements in low-income countries over that period of time, not much improvement in the middle-income countries and getting worse in both, and in high-income countries still not achieving the goals we're after, although obviously there's better results there where these sorts of interventions were designed than in the parts of the world on which or in which they're implemented. So what's going wrong here? There's probably no bigger mistake a manager or a governance of a system can make than try and treat adaptive challenges as technical problems. And I'm using slightly different words for ideas that have been already discussed this morning and introduced this morning. Technical problems are those that are easy to identify, lend themselves to quick and easy solutions. You can pull a program out of a box, plug it in and play it, and you get a result. It requires change in just a few places. I mean, your television, for instance, if it breaks, very much a technical problem. You'd get an expert in, they'd fix it, and all would be right. When we're looking at the global deaths that are transport-related in countries going through the transition of various kinds, then that list of factors doesn't describe the problem. The problem is better described by the list on the right. Challenges which are difficult to identify, require changes in values, beliefs, roles. The people with the problem are required to actually help solve the problem. They're internally managed. The solutions have to be part of the people themselves having the authority to make their own destiny. And often we actually don't necessarily have the answers we need, and we need to explore in the area of uncertainty to try and come up with those answers. Now this is where I'd like to remind ourselves of why I criticised Australia's safe systems model. We still in Australia talk about towards zero. And as I mentioned last night, or we had a conversation last night about what country in the world would set out with a vision that says away from zero. And what is that really adding to the conversation? We all want to go towards zero. The difference between a safe system which says we want to head in the right direction, we just want to compromise the benefits that we're getting out of the system so that the harms that were created by that system mean that we manage something that we're prepared to tolerate, versus this, which is very simply a rejection of any compromise in the value of human life for some other ulterior motive. That's a qualitative different beast to one that says we just want to head in that direction and we might lose a few hundred people every now and then, but that's a necessity of the gains of having that system operational for the benefits that we want in other areas. I think this is a systems approach because it sets out with a goal, doesn't prescribe how we're going to get there, and it's up to us to try and find out the means for getting there in the best possible way. You need to be systems thinkers to even understand the challenge of that question. You certainly need to be systems thinkers to do something about it. We can't just apply the same methods we've used before to this problem and expect to get a better answer. So how do we approach challenges like this? How do we approach challenges that we think are more adaptive than technical? And technical solutions are great for technical problems, but when we're talking, and I'm using technical there and not in the sense of wires and plugs, I'm talking in terms of a simple plug-in-and-play fix. So if you can't find a simple plug-in-and-play fix for something which can be circumscribed, for which an answer is known and we just need to get somebody to do it, if you can't do that and you've got something else, how do you go about solving those problems? Where's the answer if it isn't in a box that you can pull out and plug in? Well, first what we need to do is delineate, well, you need to ask the question in a way that gives you the real problem at heart. And often we spend a lot of our time working on things which actually aren't the key problem of the moment. But once we've identified this challenge, we need to delineate the systems which drive that challenge or drive that behaviour and then circumscribe them so that we've got something containable. We need to expand our field of vision about the causes and the consequences, because if we keep asking in a situation whether there's an underlying reason, a layer below or a why that's happening, if we come up with that's happening as an intermediate cause of our outcome of interest, then you can go back under that and say, why does that happen? And all of a sudden you find yourself starting to build this out into quite a multiple set of components. A system, in my mind, is nothing more than a set of components that interact to create a particular outcome. Or if it's a system we've designed, components we put together that interact for a particular purpose. And in us thinking through our challenge as a consequence of a systemic problem, it's a case of us trying to describe that system in a way that we can manage with our limited cognitive capabilities that we do have in terms of practical, identifiable component parts, and start to think about how they work together, and then start to think about how the architecture of that particular structure drives the performance that we're concerned about. Then from here you can go from a number of ways. I like to start off talking qualitatively and then moving quickly into quantitatively. Some people finish the task at the qualitative discussion and feel comfortable and then move on. But what I'm going to take you through today is something which moves very quickly into the quantitative, and then I'll acknowledge the fact that we got there through quite a lot of conversation in the past amongst people like yourselves who had a breadth of experience across a number of areas. I'm just checking, am I near enough to the microphone so that I'm coming across clearly? Good, thank you. So, systems thinking and action. I've got two examples. The first illicit example I just slipped in with the pictures of people standing and looking at walls and looking interested. I mean, you can imagine yourself up here, me trying to get that level of interest in your faces, standing out there just looking at me. Very, very hard. Incredibly easy when you start to get people involved in thinking through the problems, and you could see that demonstrated in the picture. So that's the first example I want to demonstrate. I've now got two more examples. The first one is going to exemplify the causal loop diagramming, the qualitative component of us trying to explain succinctly on a board to ourselves how we understand the architecture of the structure of a system, and then I'm going to explain to you why that, in this example I've used, was beneficial. So let's go back a little bit to what I said before about identifying the right problem, the right question. And I don't think for a lot of our adaptive challenges we get that right. The question that was being asked by the UN Decade of Action, the Global Road Safety Partnership, and subsequently the Sustainability Development Goals supporters, is how do we stabilise and then reduce the forecast level of road traffic fatalities around the world by 2020? From a systems approach, our group reframed that and said, well, that's really not the important thing. The important thing is, how do we get people mobile? How do we allow people to achieve what they're using the transport system for in a way that is advantageous to their health and well-being? And I recognised that one of the reasons why there was an increase in deaths in lower middle countries is simply that their denominator increased, not necessarily their risk. If countries are motorising, you get more cars on the road, you can drop the risk, but if they're motorising at rate, then you're going to find the number of deaths actually increase. So we also recognised that the reason countries were motorising because transport and mobility was seen to be something that was advantageous to the economic development of countries going through the development phase. So I've unpacked there a couple of assumptions which are built into the first question. The first question says cars are good, we just need to make them safer. Now, why are we saying they're good? They're partly good because they help improve the health and well-being of populations as their mobility grows, their income grows, they can address the other needs of the community like access to education and health. However, the heart and soul of what we're really trying to do is improve their health and well-being, not necessarily getting their cars to work better or safer. We used then systems dynamics as our tool. This allows you to model the effect of gradual change through social growth. We tend not to be able to replace today's world with another one. Mostly epidemiologists create counterfactuals. Wouldn't it be great if we looked different? Well, mostly we can only get to different from where we are now. And systems dynamics allows us to think through a methodology that is this where we are now and where we will get, and how do we transfer through that? How do we move through that time zone? The other thing that I want to stress here is that we're not actually coming up with a predicted number of deaths at any particular point in time. We're actually using this model to help understand that dynamic process, help us understand the system. It's a different reason for using modelling. There are two critical factors on which the model was based. Was this link between mobility and wealth that we needed to maintain, and the recognition that number of deaths is simply a product of the deaths per kilometre times the number of kilometres. We did a causal loop diagram which illustrated the collective thinking. Sorry, I've given the answer away. Collective thinking. No, it's not showing up, so I'll describe it. And the top loop, we're arguing that wealth increases education, increases health, increases wealth. You can see that circle. In the bottom loop, you've got, as wealth goes up in countries, car ownership goes up. As car ownership goes up, kilometres driven goes up. That improves people's mobility, that improves the wealth in that country. So that's a couple of virtuous cycles there where they both work with each other to improve their wealth and health, and all looks good until you start looking at the consequences of the kilometres driven. For any particular given risk, injuries will go up as the number of kilometres driven goes up, and chronic disease goes up because you tend to decrease your exercise and increase your pollution. So a system thinker will have looked at that as the mechanism and says, what's the solution? We still want mobility because that drives wealth. We don't want injuries and chronic disease. So let's see if there's another loop in there that we can try and foster. It says, can we increase mobility through another mechanism than by kilometres driven and motor vehicles? And if we can do that by changing land use, then we can get the benefits without the disbenefits of our increased mobility. We've used causal loop diagramming to help us think about the problem in a slightly more holistic manner and come up with a solution to a problem. And when we ran the data on that, and we did put numbers into that model, we found that a mode shift from individual private transport to mass transport, and towns which are more densely constructed with higher internet capabilities so that you've got mobility through multiple different channels that achieve the same social goals without actually requiring long distances to be travelled, produced a better result for their health and well-being. So that's the first example. This one I'm going to present now is one where I lift the bonnet off that quantitative modelling and show you the engine, show you actually what goes on behind the scenes there that you play with, what are the levers you can pull that drive those sorts of conclusions that I came up with that first example. But just before I do, anyone who thinks, again, that we're dealing with a simple problem, I just want to show you a clipping which I found just before we were going to present in September last year, because I sometimes look through the newspapers just before I present to see what's topical and what the context in which this talk is sitting. And this is from Australia, but I suspect it shows the similarities between the two nations in many respects, and some of you would recognise the mentality behind this sort of discussion. If we're dealing with this, then can we find a quick technical solution and ignore the fact that a lot of our constituency thinks this particular way? I'm going to show you two more prompts before I move on too. And those of you doing systems thinking or who have listened to this morning's lectures will have heard a little bit of talk about a reference mode. Those of you who aren't doing systems thinking have still asked questions in the manner which makes me feel that you already look at data like this in terms of the way the systems dynamicists do as reference modes. This is, for an epidemiologist, almost a perfect figure. I mean, this is absolutely exquisite. It starts, it goes up, it comes back down again. And I'm slowing my communication of information to you at the moment, because in your brain at the moment you're creating communication and ideas and answers yourself just by looking at it. This figure is talking to you, not necessarily telling you the answer, but you're starting to ask it more questions. What's the axis labels? Well, I can say the one at the bottom is years, starts in 1925, finishes about finishes 2017. The vertical one is deaths. Okay, so what else? Yes, it's all ages. It's the total population of people, deaths in people. Deaths in people on the road, and in this particular one, it's Australia. So there's a drop there, there's a drop there, massive increase to about there, a flat line, comes down a bit, then you get these little hooks, drops a bit and flattens out, drops a bit and flattens out, sort of like a water slide. This is around 1970. This is about 10 years later. This is 1915. It's 1920. No, 1940, sorry. And some of the answers you've come up with this morning about how do you partition something like this? Because there are lots of things going on. There's a denominator thing going on, obviously. Petrol shortage there and there in Australia, less discretional driving. Seatbelts laws came in there. Random breath testing came in there. Speed cameras came in there. There are lots of things that were going on. This gradual trend where we've had infrastructure improvements ongoing all of the time. So behind all of these behavioural changes, there's something else happening which lasts for a period of time, but it takes a long time to implement, as I've shown that. One single road on one part of Australia, $20 billion, and it's taken us 30 years to do. But nevertheless, it's having effect. There are lives being saved as a result of that, and there are lives still being saved now because of the money that was spent 10 years ago on that road. So there are lots of things happening in there. And, but nevertheless, they ask questions. And this is another figure, which you may recognise a little bit more clearly than the one I gave before. It's same period of time. It's about 1915. It's around 1940. That's around about 1970. And yes, there's presumably, as was mentioned this morning, the petrol crisis there. What's been going on here? Big drop there, that's 2009, another financial. So there are lots going on that I actually, not trying to say I know what's causing this, but this is not hypothetical. This is actually the number of people who died. So this is what we're trying to explain in all of our hypotheticals. When we do our models, they're almost, well, they're made up. This isn't made up. This is actual people, unfortunately. And we'd like to bring this one down a lot more quickly, and if it's starting to come down because of things like infrastructure, why in the hell is it going back up again every now and then? And most recently, in those last few years, there's been quite a big hiccup. So helping us understand this is the challenge. And the discussion that we had amongst our colleagues was around that question, and we decided that we couldn't tease out with any statistical rigour the component causes of that particular model in a way that was going to be useful to us. So what we did instead is we took a component of that's drug-related driving, and we've said our understanding of this collectively, using all sorts of qualitative and quantitative data, is that we're finding we get improvements followed by a flattening out and perhaps a slight incline in the rates again afterwards, in the numbers again afterwards. Now you can see any number of those similar dips in the figure that I just showed you, the water slide dip, where it seems to come down quite quickly and then flatten out and then come up a bit. Our starting point was that drug and alcohol related driving is a major cause of crash morbidity and mortality, that the road safety interventions designed to minimise the problem achieve diminishing returns, and this is almost a word-for-word quote from somebody earlier on today, and that reductions are levelling out above the nominated target. So this is a behaviour. I'm describing a reference mode here, not in a picture, but in words, to say, I want to try and see if I can come up with a structure that helps us understand how society is working to produce these observed facts. I use that word carefully because they're observations that the collective group like yourselves came up with to summarise the feeling that you had about the way that the target activity the performance indicator was tracking. Sorry, I'll just bring this up for you. The next thing we did was we recognised that at a steady point where there were as many deaths as we were expecting, no one would be too fussed and we'd carry on at a straight line. When we felt there were more deaths than we were wanting, or programmed into our logic, then there would be some sense of the community to do something about it. And those of you who look at public health or policy implementation models have come across this notion of outrage being something that's required if you're going to get policy action. Well, here we've just characterised outrage as this variable, which is really the difference between what you are happy to put up with versus what you're measuring. And as when you've got a large outrage, that generates a lot of effort to try and do something about it. When you've got no outrage, when you've got no disparity between what you think's right and what's happening, then you've got little effort to do something about it. There are a number of delays inherent in a system that's based along this logic because it takes a while to tool up, it takes a while to educate your workforce, it takes a while to find the funds to actually deliver the change. So while you recognise something, there is an outrage, you need to do something about it. Policy implementation takes a little while, so you need to build that into your model. Because recognising that I'm now thinking about this process of change over time. How do we move forward from where we are to where we need to be, and how does the model help us understand that process? So while this might not be particularly apparent to you, number one and number two are basically loops. As something happens, something else happens, something else happens, something else happens, and as a result that changes the first thing again. So you can articulate that as a loop. And at this particular point, I'm going to break out of the display, and I'll come back to the display in a minute just to lift the boot on what's going on here. There are 3 modules in this model, and this particular module is the main loop of interest. Where, and I think you can see that, we've got, this is the amount of enforcement and education. I'm arguing that most of the intervention I'm talking about now for drug and alcohol is going to be enforcement and education. While there are some infrastructure changes and they will have an effect, I'll say they're actually operating a status quo. The things that are going to change is going to be our increased enforcement and education around drug abuse. So this is the amount that we've currently got at status quo. The proportion who drive under the influence times the numbers of kilometres they drive produces, at a risk of crash per kilometres, produces the number of serious injuries and crashes per year. And I've just standardised this using just normalised numbers, not necessarily numbers that reflect the real world, but in this particular case, at status quo, I've got 100 crashes, serious crash deaths per year. If the outrage factor is the difference between that and the target, at the moment I've got a target of 100, so there's no outrage, and no outrage means no policy action, so we've got exactly the same enforcement, so we've got exactly the same number of habitual drink drivers who drive the same number of kilometres, who kill themselves at the same rate, and we've got all of this sitting in harmony. Now, if you dropped the target number to 70, you'll find that the outrage goes up, policy action goes up, enforcement and education goes up, proportion who drive under the influence goes down, therefore the total kilometres driven go down, the crashes go down, and the outrage factor goes down. So we've actually got a loop that operates as a balancing loop, and this is the main loop driving the model, and I'll now flick to the results section. But you can see how you can populate these quite easily. The loops are created from the conversations that we would all have about how we understand the system works. We build those assumptions into something like this. We get comfortable that we think, yeah, this is pretty much how we think it works. There are two other parts of this model. This is the numbers of people who have a drug and alcohol misuse in the population who are not drivers, but that reflects how many are likely to be drivers. And then the model underneath, which I've lifted into here, is really the compliance resistance that occurs if you tell somebody to do something they don't want to do. So I'll refer to those two other secondary loops when I look through the results in just a minute. Sorry, I'm juggling between programs. This is a figure over time, 30-year simulation. On the right, we've got crashes per year, and this is the point, the 100, that I had nominally identified this model was going to produce at equilibrium. The straight line means that over the 30 years, nothing much has changed. So we stay producing the same answer that we produced to start with. If you keep doing the same thing, you're going to get the same answer. And I've left the model variables that I want to change up here so I can do them quite efficiently for you. When I turn the road safety switch on and run that model again, that road safety switch said that I want over 30 years to produce a 50% reduction in road deaths, and we're going to increase our road safety effort accordingly to try and achieve that. You'll find there's a massive improvement to start with, but because I've got delays in the system, it tends to overshoot, and as it gets closer and closer to the target that we're after, the amount of outrage drops, the effort drops, and the system fights back. It's a balancing loop that finds some point of equilibrium a lot higher than the 50 that I was expecting it to achieve when we set 50 as the target, because the business as usual is 100. So we've got to do something out of the ordinary to get it to 50, and there comes a point where doing something out of ordinary starts to balance out with this driving force to keep producing the 100. And that's the result, and the oscillation is the delay in the feedback loops. We look at what was going on there. I've added two more of the variables in the model to the chart. This is the one that we've just shown that improves, but the outrage factor goes up to start with because I said we need to drop these numbers a lot. And the green is the amount of road safety effort. So the road safety effort follows the outrage pretty much the same way because I've got a direct one-to-one relationship with just a bit of a delay. And it's a result of that going up. So we've got 1.5 times the effort required to reduce the effect of the intervention, not by half. If we change that as our intervention instead, went down and did a public health intervention, which said, let's forget about road safety. Let's just try and reduce the amount of alcohol misuse in the population, and therefore there'll be fewer people misusing alcohol in the population to end up on the road. We don't find a lot of those negative feedback loops. We find that the amount of road safety effort follows the amount of outrage, which follows the reduction, but the outrage is dropping. So we're finding that while we started off with doing this much road safety effort at a normalised 1, after a while we're finding the work for us is being done by the public health people. We can slacken off and reduce the amount of road safety effort we put in place. So this number still doesn't get down to the 50 we want to get down to. If we put in the road safety effort and the population alcohol management effort in at the same time, we actually do hit our target. And we hit our target that produces a pretty much normal expenditure response on road safety after a period of time, after the initial kick that was required to get into action. So the only other thing I wanted to bring out, because I am running out of time, but I think that's illustrated at least one angle for using this, is a recognition that you can't do this in isolation from public's response. And these bottom two figures are public response. So this is our normal road safety intervention. We're expecting the public to actually buy into random breath testing, which I gather is not going to be that easy in some parts of the US. So let's put in a resistance factor of a resistance delay of 1.5 here. Now the model initially said that while you put in bad news intervention, the public get used to it in a year and they move on. All I've done now is say the public don't get used to this intervention in a year. That takes them a year and a half. So this back sort of ground angst lasts a little bit longer than the year, and you'll find that there's a large outrage without too much of an effort, because the pushback from the public has meant that a lot of that outrage didn't get converted into road safety effort because the policymakers were fighting trying to push this through, and the effect on the road toll then went up. Now, at the moment you're probably saying, yeah, these are a whole lot of numbers, but I'm actually getting to a really strong point here, because unless this is useful, it's just a game for geeks in the background. I'm going to show you one more before I move on to the last couple of slides, and that's what happens if we make the resistance as big as the intervention. So up to this point I've been saying the resistance from the public is about half as much as the effort of the people trying to push it in. Let's make it as much as the effort as people trying to push it in, but still let it wash out in 12 months' time. And we get a much bigger oscillation for very much the same outcome. So, well, and basically if you're continuing to fight the people who don't want you to put the intervention in, you can't spend your time working on the intervention, you start separating the people who are outraged about the event from the people who are actually fighting the solution, and you get massive oscillations. And you get to a point where you can get debate becoming heated, aggressive, unproductive. Which explains what the Australian TAC is currently doing at the moment. It's got an advertising campaign at the moment which is doing nothing more than trying to make the public understand the position of the police as people who are helping them live healthy and safe lives, and trying to ostracise people who are criticising the police involvement in a way that make them look silly amongst their colleagues. So the newspapers are starting to push stupidity on the roads. You know, you wouldn't be stupid, would you? This is not about independence. This is not about freedom. This is about stupidity, and no one wants to put their hand up and say, I want to be one of those. So the rhetoric of the conversation in the media is changing. And this is the latest TAC ad.
police than ever are working the holidays to keep us safe during ours.
Great, thank you.
Let's all play our part in keeping our roads safe.
So you can see for road safety, that didn't have much road safety in it. It wasn't directed at road safety, it was directed at the people so that they could buy into the fact that the enforcement that the police were putting in place was something that they didn't need to resist because it was actually, police were on their side. So it was very much a feel-good. And it's a feel-good so that that resistance would disappear, so that the amount of effort that then had to go into trying to fight the policy to produce the enforcement and what was going to produce the result was ultimately much less. So what I've covered in the last 45 minutes is not as persuasive as the 45 minutes before that. It was an attempt to make it look straightforward, easy, demonstrate how it can help, and give you some examples of how you could put it into use. And to, in the context of that, allow you to start thinking through when you continue to get the urge and the drive to think as a systems thinker, what that actually means for what you put into place yourself in your own workplace or set of tools that you normally use. I did do a lot of this work with colleagues, and they're acknowledged here. The human factors and participatory group modelling is quite a exhaustive process that goes on over a period of time, and I've had a fair bit of assistance with that. And I'll finish with the comment that was also made by Kristen this morning, that there's not much point walking around saying the system is broken. The system's never broken, it's just producing an answer you don't want. So what is the system that's doing that, and how can we tweak it to produce a better result? So I think we've got 15 minutes, and I think Steve's prepared to leave me up here exposed. So you're asking me the questions, and I'm more than happy to reflect them back to you. And I've left about 20 minutes, so feel free to ask difficult ones.
Hello, I've got one over here.
Oh,
Hi, thanks for your talk. So in the US, I think we find that most people are unaware of the public health impact of crashes. We heard earlier today that most crashes aren't covered in the news, and unfortunately, unless people have been affected personally, they're not aware of what's going on. But as you pointed out, outrage can really help to kind of build that sense of urgency behind a community and to fuel demand for change. So I'm curious about any recommendations you have about educating that risk without crossing over into fear appeals, doom and gloom, right? What that balancing act might look like, and if you have any recommendations.
Yes, thank you for that question. It is very much a balancing act. I calculated once I would have to drive 25,000 years in order to ensure that I'd die on the road. I also calculated that if I didn't drive very quickly, I'd miss the shop before it closed. Got to the shop just before it closed, and I won't tell you what speed I was doing. And I got the positive reward of getting whatever I needed to buy. And that happens on an ongoing basis. My risk of actually dying as an individual, the ability of an individual to spend their day doing risk calculations is not good. That's why we all develop heuristics and cheap, quick ways of making our decisions. But if you look at the population numbers, for a sec. So I think we've got 15 minutes, and I think Steve's prepared to leave me up here exposed. So you're asking me the questions, and I'm more than happy to reflect them back to you. I've left about 20 minutes, so feel free to ask difficult ones.
Hello. I've got one over here.
Oh, man.
Hi. Thanks for your talk. So in the U.S., I think we find that most people are unaware of the public health impact of crashes. We heard earlier today that most crashes aren't covered in the news, and unfortunately, unless people have been affected personally, they're not aware of what's going on. But as you pointed out, outrage can really help to kind of build that sense of urgency behind a community and to fuel demand for change. So I'm curious about any recommendations you have about educating that risk without crossing over into fear appeals, doom and gloom, right? What that balancing act might look like, and if you have any recommendations.
Yes, thank you for that question. It is very much a balancing act. I calculated once I would have to drive 25,000 years in order to ensure that I'd die on the road. I also calculated that if I didn't drive very quickly, I'd miss the shop before it closed. Got to the shop just before it closed, and I won't tell you what speed I was doing. And I got the positive reward of getting whatever I needed to buy. And that happens on an ongoing basis. My risk of actually dying as an individual, the ability of an individual to spend their day doing risk calculations is not good. That's why we all develop heuristics and cheap, quick ways of making our decisions. But if you look at the population numbers, for a city the size of Atlanta, let's take Melbourne, Australia, who've got slightly different philosophies on road safety. One has twice as many deaths in a year as the other. So there are 300 deaths in Atlanta, more than there are in Melbourne for the same population. So I think that's the question you can put to people. I'm not sure you could put to people just the question of risk and how big your risk is. Although we all talk in risks and we all operate in risks, the public I don't think operates terribly well in risks. And responsibility for my own risk I'm prepared to take. The shift I've just then articulated is, should we be responsible for the risks? Sorry, should we be responsible for the population deaths of our tribe, our group? In which case it's now a collective risk. And now a lot of you are already recognising the challenges of that sort of shift in thinking. But I think that's the shift in thinking which occurred in the 1970s. You could see the Australian picture went very high to about 1970 and then something happened. And it was because it was going so high so quickly that the surgeons who were getting flooded in the emergency departments with trauma, and just about everybody had somebody they knew who had died, there was that tipping point at that stage, and people said we need to do something about it. So how do you create that tipping point? But then also, how do you face up to conversations like, should we be responsible for the collective deaths of our group, or should we just be responsible for our own individual one? It's all part of that conversation about putting yourself in your big car because you're safer there, recognising your big car may be more harmful to somebody else who you hit. So I would answer every question like that with, we need to learn to have conversations. And then we need to maintain those conversations, so our conversation is actually front of mind, given the number of other conversations that people have about other needs and other possibilities. But you may not be able to solve all of the problems, but at least you can get the number of harm in one population to match that of the other. And that's Jeffrey Rose, who is probably the one book I would recommend anybody read, whatever field they come from, whenever, and that was written about 30 years ago. All we need to do is compare the crash deaths in Boston versus Atlanta and say, they're different. Why are they different? Now let's explore that. What can we do? We can't turn Boston physically into Atlanta. We may be able to do a lot more than we're currently doing physically about it. Recognise, once we've worked out what the levers are that are driving the differences in the two rates. So conversation is good, outrage is good, trying to work out which is the conversation which is going to tap into people's values and beliefs. We do need a microphone probably down here. Not so that I can hear you, but so everyone else can.
Hi, I'm Noreen McDonald from UNC Chapel Hill. Thanks very much for your talk. I really enjoyed the model you were sort of running on the fly for us at the end, and I was curious if you've shared it with any policymakers or people more in public agencies particularly, and what their reaction was.
I finished it about 2 days ago, and no one's seen it but you guys.
That's why you take long plane rides.
It's not true. I did send a brief copy to Kristen and Co because they needed to know what I was going to say after them. But no, it hasn't been tested live by anybody yet. It will be.
I'm really impressed by the campaign ad that you showed there at the end, and I wonder if another way to ask for the public support and lower resistance is on the fiscal side, paying for it, because having great mobility and great safety at the same time probably costs more than what we're doing now. Are you aware of any campaigns, successful campaigns, to engage people with, hey, if you're willing to spend more in this fee or that fee, we're going to use it to make the roads safer for you, and therefore support this revenue generating?
Well, we certainly get attacked very heavily in our compulsory speed cameras as being revenue raisers, and the public do not like that whatsoever. So that's a campaign in the opposite direction, an illustration that people don't like to pay out of that pocket for general safety. However, the ANCAP, and you've probably got an equivalent here, I don't know quite what it is, but it's the crash ratings that motor vehicle manufacturers submit to get 5-star ratings on the safety of their car, at least in Australia, is being used as a sales pitch. So there is some people are being encouraged to pay a bit more for a little bit safety, or as long as they don't have to pay too much. And given if they can get it for the same price and it's safer, they will tend to go that way versus the other way. So I suspect there's a price point in there somewhere. But I also find myself answering people's questions instead of throwing them back to you guys. So I tend to always admit that I don't know as much, but then I still hog the floor. So if anybody wants to answer those questions in my place, please jump in and do so.
Hey, okay. Jane Terry from National Safety Council, thank you so much for being here. And one of the things that you mentioned was the role of the media, and even like thinking about automated enforcement and things like that, and how the media can help and it can also hurt your efforts. It seems like y'all have been able to gain some traction in a positive way with media. How have you done that? I mean, we lose over 100 people a day here in this country, and nobody cares. Yeah. It seems like, at least not in the media. Yeah. And when you talk about things like automated enforcement, where it is indiscriminate of who it catches, it probably has caught some people in the media, and they get mad about it, and so they investigate it. And so just if you have any advice of how to engage the media on some of this, I'd appreciate it.
I'm never very keen ever to give advice, but I can give you a case study of Victoria, which I think is really illustrative. I keep using Victoria because of all of the Australian states, it produced the best result. It put the most effort in. It's a small state. It's down the bottom east of the country. It's got about 6 million people in it. It's relatively close to the capital cities. It's not sprawled like some of your western states would be, or some of ours are. So they did 3 things, and it's worked. They got bilateral support from both major parties. They jumped on the outrage that occurred in the 1970s when leading figures were saying this is outrageous that we've got so many of our young people dying on the road. We need to do something about it. They developed a 30-year strategy, so it could last that long because both sides bought into it. And they then institutionalised those changes in the government bureaucracies and put KPIs on the government bureaucracies and the CEOs of those bureaucracies to deliver on those outcomes. They then, parallel to that, had a centralised, and this is the advantages of a situation which you don't necessarily always have everywhere, they had a single insurer for motor vehicle crash injuries. And then they had a single road authority for that state that registered and managed the roads. And then they got the 2 big universities on board and gave them a whole lot of money, so then they had road safety research groups doing research on this area. And then they got the media on board, and they managed, and I don't know how they did this, to get them to buy into this as a sporting contest. And they repeated the road toll every week what it was this week, what it was this week, what it was this, and got the public to buy into a discussion around this. And then the conversation was being had between the government, the universities, the public, the newspapers, and that discussion just kept ricocheting around. And various achievements were being heralded and supported. And for a period of time, that was an incredibly large media feature. Now that's tailed off over time, but nevertheless, there's still enough bite in the system for any of those numbers to go back up. Then the media will actually buy in on the side of the good guys to try and say what's going on here, whose fault's this, why is it still going up? The aggressive independence for this is a nanny state trying to tell us how to drive our cars hasn't been portrayed by the government, by the media. So somewhere, somehow, somebody's got to the chief media companies and said, come on board with us on this, don't try and undermine it.
Hi, Leah Shea, I'm with the Vision Zero Network. In the spirit of your first comments about this being a room of experts and expertise and experience, I'd like to ask the room a question. And maybe you said it somewhere and I didn't hear it appropriately, so enough. Ultimately, where does the responsibility lie in the US to shift to system safety in our transportation work? Because if it lies with all of us, with everyone, it lies with no one. I mean, you know what I mean? It does lie with all of us, obviously, but I'd love to hear people's thoughts on where does this need to live in this country. And if you have thoughts on that too, but I guess I'd like to put it out to the room.
Hi, I'm Heidi Perry from Bike Walk NC, and I know that when we were talking a few months ago about autonomous vehicles and what they can and can't see, and of course bicycles are really hard for them to identify, and we were looking at a similar situation in Europe where they are required, before they go on the road, they have to prove that they can see people and bicyclists. And in the US, that is not in their, it's not one of the things they have to do to get these cars on the road because they're only concerned about property damage to cars. And so it's not coming from the top down like it is in Europe. And I think that's a big problem for us.
Mm. It requires courage, doesn't it, to some extent, of the legislators and the regulators to put expectations on the public that the public doesn't want to wear, which is where places like the universities are that third voice. I, at that stage, was running a university research centre where the government used to come to us and say, we can't come out in public and call this because the public don't like this. Can you do the science and tell us what the answer is? And then we would go public with what we thought the science was. And then the newspapers. So again, there has to be some serious buy-in from the people who have the clout to regulate. But they need to be supported by the public because they can't make calls that are going to get them voted out of office. So it's back to everybody being, where does the responsibility lie? Well, in any democracy, where does the responsibility lie? Distributed governance and individual citizens' responsibility to stand up and then have the systems and the structure, social institutions strong enough, robust enough to head for what is good for the community rather than... I've got an article that I was involved with on injury prevention as social change, and I think that's the answer to the question. Injury prevention is not something you do on a community. It's something that community decides it needs to do in order to improve the community's goals. And if society is nothing more than an organisation to allow us to improve our health and well-being, and this is an indicator of our health and well-being, then we should get on and fix it. The truth isn't out there with some hand that's going to come in and sort it out for us. It's us working out what our... And the other thing is, with systems, it's all too hard, it's all too big, everything's connected to everything. With our entire organisation of a social structure is nothing more than a system, and we need to manage it and operate it and get it to produce the best result. And we've got tools in there to do so. They're political tools, they're social tools, they're interpersonal tools. These are the tools that you need to use and take responsibility throughout all of that. The only question then comes back into the values of that system and what is that system working to try and achieve. And that is more of a general discussion. Is it individual freedom, or is it population well-being? Is it diversity of my opportunities, or is it generic safety for my children? So these are the discussions that have to be had, which feed back into what the legislators and the regulators are then allowed to do in terms of enforcing the political will or the will of the population that they're serving.
Well, thanks, Rod, for a great talk. I think the irony of having a New Zealander introduce an Australian was largely lost on the room. You know, I do want to answer Leah's question, because I think Leah has posed us a very valuable, very important question. Who owns it, right? Like, we all think we own a piece of it, but who actually owns it? And I think, you know, if you would take a friendly amendment, my amendment to your question would be, what is it? What do we mean by safety, right? Like, I think we think of safety as an individual attribute that we purchase in an automobile, or, you know, something we buy a safe car, right? But that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is changing the system in which the motor vehicles and the other road users operate. So our construct of safety needs to change from a very capitalist-driven system to a collective system. Or put another way, we need to own it as a community, as a population, right? When I hear Leah talk, I get jazzed because she's great and she sounds to me like a population person, you know, even though she probably wouldn't want that label. So, you know, there's not many places in the United States where, you know, I don't think we're going to have this from elected officials. This isn't Sweden or New South Wales or Queensland, right? I mean, you know, look at our political system. We're not going to produce leadership through our elections that exert this kind of influence on society. So I think the answer to Leah's question is the insurance industry owns it, right? Health insurance, particularly, but also roadway insurance, motor vehicle insurance. So I think that's the community that we need to engage and pull some of these concepts in and get them to the table and expose them to our way of thinking, because ultimately, in America, dollars count, right?
Are there any other questions or comments?
We wouldn't bother.
I'm Ben Welly with World Resources Institute. My question is, when we did a report on safe system approach, and one thing we found was the Swedish Vision Zero and sustainable safety in the Netherlands. There's been some analysis that they don't actually reflect true systems thinking. If you look, you know, there's been some articles on this. And I think, as to your presentation, how much should safe system, for when it comes to road safety, how much should it actually reflect like pure systems thinking, as opposed to some more, I mean, how sort of concepts that can be communicated to the public, to politicians, to policymakers. I struggle a little bit with that, and just thinking based on some of the images and visual aids in your presentation, how that might be, how some of that might be from your own thinking.
Yeah. Thanks very much for that. I know that some of that work that you people have been doing, WRI have been doing, especially around urban design as an intervention for road safety. And I guess you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but you don't want to have such a reductionist model of intervention that you miss some really great opportunities for solution. And I think one of the ways that Australia has operationalised Vision Zero is very reductionist. It's been incredibly effective in some ways, but it's effective under the assumptions that stand in Australia. They're not the assumption that would hold in a lot of the places WRI work. And you might get and certainly in the second example I used where we modelled growth, improvements in mobility across 6 cities in the world, the cities that were just greenfield sites were the ones that got the best benefit out of the alternative means of mobility than improving the road safety. In cities which are already structured around cars, best thing you can do is improve road safety. In cities which have got no dependence upon cars, then what you do is you change your urban design, you change your modes of transport, create mass transport options. So safe systems didn't, I think, work for the lower and middle income countries in the figure that I just described. A systems thinking approach would have been much better. But having said that, in Australia, getting the roads, cars and road users to behave did produce some real advantage. So I guess as long as you're not using any particular dogma at the expense of achieving the best possible outcome, then use whatever dogma you can get hold of. Because what is going to determine whether you use it or not is its usefulness. It's not right or wrong in any other way than if actually it helps you see the problem, helps you articulate the problem, and helps you get the best performance outcome in terms of that particular indicator. Henry Ford said, didn't he, that if I'd asked anybody at the time what they needed, they would have said a faster horse. So you've got to actually work out what your goal is you want, and then start from a completely free, and the system engineers would tell me this all of the time, is that you don't start off with your constraints and try and get a better outcome. You start off with your outcome and then try and create a place without the constraints. So I think that answers your question. I always feel when I've talked about something as big as this, that I've just taken a little bit of a walk through one particular part of the park, and the rest of the park's out there, and all of those wonderful orchids and things that you haven't seen, because we just need yet time to move into that part of it. So, but on the other hand, you can get there eventually. So as long as what you've heard today, or from me, you can sort of operationalise back in terms of what you heard from the speakers before me, then you're probably going to continue to benefit from it over the next couple of days.
Answering there. Thanks a lot, Rod. You've given us a fascinating insight into systems models. And we're going to take a short recess. We'll reconvene in about 12 minutes. But join me in thanking Rod for his talk.